fiction was started by men for women to keep them occupied.
And then you think about booksellers and bookshops and libraries even, that libraries free accessibility to books. Well, who's deciding what books go in there? It's so intertwined and linked.
What's something that's really important for anyone looking to tell new stories and find new stories is to look outside of themselves.
We're saving the powers of concentration.
Because it's so important.
Because in this world, there are no powers of concentration left.
And there have been stories coming from everywhere forever, we just haven't been looking for them.
100%. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, that story is making a difference in your life and it will change the path that you go on.
Welcome to London College of Communication's Valley Talks, a series where we bring together figures from across different industries to talk about contemporary issues and creativity. Today we'll discuss how to tell powerful stories, from identifying great ideas to linking artists and platforms and collaborating with new talent. I'm surrounded by an esteemed panel and I would like to go on the table. So Louise, would you introduce yourself first?
My name is Louise Moore. I am very happy to say I'm a governor at UAL. Also, I work in publishing and I run a part of Penguin Random House, which is the largest publisher in the world. We publish commercial fiction and non-fiction. We have a big list. And I've worked there for, over 20 years now.
Awesome.
Hi, my name's Holly Fraser. I used to be a student at LCC, graduated in 2008 from the journalism course. I'm now the editor-in-chief of WePresent, which is WeTransfer's digital arts and editorial platform, where we work with artists from all over the world to tell stories of creativity and representation.
I'm Tash Walker. I work in queer history, archives, untold stories, around audio storytelling, podcast production, and also platform women and non-binary people in music who are underrepresented.
Awesome. Thank you very much for coming today, guys. First question I must ask is, how do you know which stories are worth telling? What's the little inklings that you get, or what goes on when you hear an idea for a story?
Well, for me, I can dive right in. One of the biggest stories I've spent several years telling is around LGBTQI plus history. And for me, when I grew up I'm a queer person. I grew up not understanding or knowing anything around LGBT plus history. And I think that's what it is. It's about telling a story that is ultimately mine, that I never knew. And finding these archives, going back into history, opening them up, reading something that not only represents me, but also so many other people, but that ultimately hasn't been told. So hidden histories, maybe we call them censored. But I think it's that, isn't it? A retelling or a telling of something that you've never heard before.
For me, I think it's something that makes you feel something. I commission stories across film, art, music, design and literature, and we get so many submissions on a daily basis, and they're all good, mostly. But there's only a few that really kind of resonate and make you actually feel something. And one of the stories that we told most recently was a short film called The Long Goodbye, which was created by Riz Ahmed and the director Anil Korea. And it's sort of set in a semi-sort of dystopian future, which looks at the rise of racism in Britain. It's something that is not particularly far removed from the truth, and it's a story that when you watch it, you kind of feel like you've been sucker punched, and you need to take a moment to sort of really let it sink in. And I think for me, it's stories that, whether it's across film or literature or music, as long as they have a resonance with an audience and really make you feel something, that's when, for me, I know it's a good story.
What about you, Louise?
Slightly different answer for me, I think, because we publish fiction and non-fiction, and I think there are two different responses for that. So a piece of non-fiction, something that's a true story, it's whether or not that person is authentic and they have a valid story to tell, whatever it is, or they're going to help somebody or instruct somebody. If it's fiction, it's much more emotional response, and it's around the voice more than anything. But it's also, for me, a story that works is always a story that's, if it's fiction, is completely got that person, the person that's writing it, there's nothing between that person and what you're reading. So with non-fiction, there can be something between that person and what you're reading, because they are giving you, they're unfolding often someone else's story, sometimes their own story, but they're telling it almost at a distance. With fiction, you've got to be right in the middle of it without a barrier.
And just to pick up on something...
So it's how rather than what sometimes.
Thank you, Louise. What I wanted to pick up from what you were saying in terms of non-fiction is most of the stories you're dealing with are still non-fiction, but do you still find that you have to be removed from it, from the content or the creator? Or do you find that for you, in your two worlds, you want that person to be in it, whereas for Louise, it's more removed from it, if you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. I think, when I'm talking about sort of a good story for me is something that elicits some kind of an emotional response, it doesn't need to mean that I come from that same lived experience as the person that is telling that story. But I think that so many good stories can be boiled down to sort of, primal human emotion. And I think that is something that quite often, regardless of, background or where you're from or what your lived experience is something that we can all resonate with. So when I'm talking about stories that elicit an emotional response, I think that is something that is quite universal. And I completely agree with, what everyone is saying. I think that for too long, the people that have been able to tell those stories has been quite homogenized. Yeah. But now we're sort of entering into a realm where everyone has more of a voice, everyone's story is relevant, and we're seeing that people's stories that maybe were censored in the past, or people that didn't have a platform to tell those stories, are being given that platform, and the powers that be are seeing that these people's stories do have a resonance and are making a connection with people. And so I think that talking about emotion, it sort of quite often for me boils down to that as a very base level. And I think that there are so many people telling important stories, but what connects them all is this emotion. So I think for me, you don't have to be in it in terms of fully understanding what that person has been through. And I don't think we'll ever be able to fully understand what different people have gone through depending on their background, experience and life. But if you can have compassion and if you can connect with the story through that point, I think that's when for me it becomes extremely important to tell it.
So you two actually are dealing largely with true stories. So I think what I'm saying is we deal with true stories as well. But if you're dealing with fiction, you're dealing with someone's imagination. Yeah. You're dealing with someone's own total creativity. And where does that come from? And that, to me, is still a mystery somewhat after over 35 years, because some people can do it and some people can't. And it's no good. If you can't, you can't. I wish a few people had learnt that.
Have any authors ever sort of said to you, this is where I get it from, or is it sort of a secret for those ones that you feel?
I think maybe for fiction, a lot of the time, people who are very good, successful fiction writers have had something happen in their life which is quite fundamental and which triggers something which enables them to escape into that part of their brain where they can just let rip. But it's what I meant about not letting anything get between you and the page if you're a writer like that, because if you're really having to work at what you're writing and think about it and analyse it constantly, it's going to be much tougher to make it work, if you can make it work at all. So it does just sort of come. And the most amazing thing I've ever seen, I worked for a long time before she died with Sue Townsend, who wrote Adrian Mole, and she couldn't see at the end of her life. So she would, I would go down sometimes and stay with her, and she would actually write by talking, and then I would type it up. And I did it, and her husband did it, and her granddaughter did it, and between the three of us, we got it down. And you would actually see her doing that, and actually it kind of is sort of coming out of her, because that's how she just forgot we were there in a way. And then sometimes she'd go, and then she'd say, read it back, and you'd read it back, and then she'd just switch 3 words in a sentence. And so that for me was kind of like the cutting edge of watching a writer create, because you don't get that.
There's nothing more raw than that, right?
Nothing rawer than that, because they're on their own.
Storytelling's so fascinating though, isn't it? Because it's like ways of survival throughout history, and folklore and music and all of those things are just different forms of storytelling. And fiction, I suppose, is only ever based on something or some kind of emotional experience that you've had before, and you recreate that in the characters that you have. And through the stories that I suppose I tell, that made this podcast called The Logbooks, which is all about LGBTQ plus history, and it's based on these true stories, based on the physical logbooks that were written and made at this charity called Switchboard, the LGBT plus helpline, started in 1974 and the logbooks run to 2003. And these stories are so incredibly relatable. I remember opening up, finding these logbooks and just being overwhelmed by how much of myself I saw in this. But I grew up thinking I was the only one person like that. And these stories, despite being 70s, 80s, 90s, whenever, are so similar to what's happening today. And it's this retelling of stories, the relatability of it. Fiction, you read an incredible book, fiction, and suddenly you feel seen. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. That story is making a difference in your life, and it will change the path that you go on. And what you were saying about whether you can relate to a story or not relate to a story, a new podcast that I'm working on is still queer theme, but it's called Black and Gay Back in the Day, and it's based on a black queer photo archive. And we're working with younger black LGBTQ plus people to take the photo literally down story lane and investigate what was happening at that time, because these are stories that we've never heard before. But so how can you, if you can't look back to look forward, where does the fiction come from? Where does our future come from?
I mean, the next question I have, I think you guys have kind of already answered it, but how do you identify how to tell a story, like what medium? So, Louise, I'm sure you predominantly work in books, but do you ever come across a book that this needs to be a film? And for you guys, both podcasts and mostly in film and photography, I don't know?
Film photography, yeah.
Do you ever get it where it's the other way? It's like, this would be amazing in print. Like, how do you know what the story needs? How do you know how to best tell it?
I think for me, I think it's quite rare that a different book could come from another medium where someone thinks. I think podcasts are a great way to produce books, and I'm always coming up with ideas for new books, non-fiction books predominantly. Listening to podcasts, saying, "Oh my God, I've got to find out a bit more about that," and then you hear who's involved in that, and then you can find a writer that way. So it's becoming a great way to find new writers, actually, for us. But films. Rarely, you'd never really want a book after a film has come out to be written like a film. But actually, we get a lot of film scouts and come to us because they're looking, because they are very successfully making so many books from films, and they have done since films began. But I don't think the two work hand in hand. I think probably, or the three or the four, I think they're all different mediums. They all need their own creative values to work. You can't just go, I'm going to do it like the book, or I'm going to do it like the podcast. You have to think of it in a different way, because you're receiving it as an audience in a different way, whether you're listening to it. I mean, it's interesting, the audiobook industry has just gone through the roof. I can't remember how many percentage points we are up on our as part of a sale, and we're seeing some of our print sales go into audio now because people love listening to stories. That's the best thing ever, isn't it? And it's it's another author of mine, Stephen Fry, and he's narrated a lot of audiobooks. And when you go to a book signing with him, mostly what you hear is, I listened to such and such all the way round America, or my kids have
sleep.
Yes, my kids have gone to sleep. Listening to your voice, and you think how lovely, because you're combining a fiction with that kind of the talent of. But actually, a lot of actors are terrible at audiobooks because they don't. It's a different skill.
Do you think that helps to remove the barrier that you were talking about before, because it's this intimacy that it's going into your ear?
Maybe.
Suddenly you're not interacting with the book, you're just being submerged in the sound.
Maybe. And I think for people who find it difficult to read, of which there are many, many millions, and for lots of different reasons, audio is amazing. Amazing. Imagine you could listen to the whole of Jane Austen or whatever you want to listen to without having to struggle with those words. And I think it's a different experience, isn't it? But it's an interesting one, I think, because reading a story is a very calming thing as well, because you have to give yourself to it. Whereas if you're watching something, you can think about other things at the same time. And I think people who have a lot of anxiety, reading particularly is a brilliant way to deal with that, because you can't commit to anything else when you're doing that.
We're all different, aren't we? Like, how we learn is different, and I think there's something innate about being told a story. Like, when we're a kid, it's like, read me a story to go to bed, right? But like, for my example, myself, I find I need to try with audiobooks more, but I tried with one audiobook, it didn't really work for me. The actual act of reading I think it's because I'm quite active,
Yeah.
slows me down. And even though
Yeah.
I'm not the best reader, I wouldn't say I've read many books in my time.
Yeah.
But when I get into it, just the act of knowing it's an accomplishment, I don't know, maybe I just like to...
It's wonderful. That
Yeah.
But it gives you focus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think that, if we're thinking about the type of artwork and content and everything that's out there at the moment, there is so much that you're constantly, when you go on Netflix or something, you spend half an hour flicking through before you choose what to listen to.
Yeah.
When you go on sometimes a podcast, on your phone, you're flicking through and you're like, I don't know what these are about, but actually picking up a book that you have chosen to pick up and that you were committed to finishing allows you to focus on something for a lot longer than I think we're allowed to, or we allow ourselves to focus on other types of content throughout our daily lives now. And I know a lot of journalists, for example, that find it really hard to sit down and read a book now because they spend their whole day reading and editing other people's copy. So I think in that sense, that's when something like a podcast is really important, because it's just another way of actually being able to absorb the information. But I think for me, I'm a big reader, and I think that it's about, like what you were saying, Tim, focus and being able to slow your mind for a moment and stop the emails and notifications and actually focus on someone else's story, which is...
We tried to come up with why we were relevant, which took a long time and a lot of brand agency money, actually. But go, guess what books are? And one of the things we talked about was we're saving the powers of concentration.
Yeah.
Because
it's so important.
Because in this world, there are no powers of concentration left. I haven't got any. I think I'm naturally not a very concentrated sort of person anyway.
Put myself in your bracket.
Yeah. But do you read fiction, Tim?
If I'm currently reading a fiction book, but it would have... I don't want to say how long I've been reading this fiction book for.
Okay.
But
it's kind of interesting because fiction was started by men for women to keep them occupied. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, in the late 18th century. Oh, yes. And that's carried on. That's carried on. And fiction is still largely, as we know from our data, read by women. Largely, And I don't really understand why that is. And I was asking a student at LCC, actually, who was a very bright guy, and he was working on the publishing course, and he said, I don't think that for men it's the same currency as it is for women. And it's not something you use as currency, whereas we're seeing a lot of younger women now with TikTok, BookTok. Reading is a real currency. It's a way of communicating. It is a way, it's like you were saying, Tash, it's a way of sharing an experience, an emotional experience. And the more that men can do that as well, the better, really, because...
Oh, that's a great question. The only thing I can think of in my world is that between me and my male friends, we'd probably tell each other stories of just our day-to-day. But when we're looking to read something, we're trying to grab something. So, a lot of my... I've got one friend of mine from Swindon, and he loves... we send each other motivational posts, so, any motivational book. So, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or... and a lot of it, especially around my friends, is how to be better with money. So it's a lot of books around that and how to make sure we're financially stable and making better financial decisions.
I need to make a note here.
No, but but then I think from my world, it's also understanding that I'm second generation Nigerian. So it's understanding that now we've got a platform where we're fortunate enough to have grown up in this country, understand the education system, understand the ways the land works. But now it's also making sure that our money and everything is staying within our four walls, but also just doing better decisions with it. So I think
reading is an investment for you.
Yeah,
you need to get something out of it.
Exactly. Whereas I think reading the story, it's not an investment, but I think the idea that, I can read this book and become more knowledgeable. I know this sounds really archaic. As a man, as a person that can help my family, my friends. I think I'm not trying to, let me not generalize this because this will go on Twitter, but I just think for most men it's more like that. Whereas I think, because I don't mind, I love a good story, but I would probably watch film or go to an exhibition. I like photography, I do photography, so I'd go to a photo book and I would more get my story from that and kind of make the dots.
For you, it's sort of reading to learn as opposed to reading for enjoyment. And I know a lot of men the same. My partner, he reads fact books and sort of geographical history books and things like that, where very, very seldom will he read a sort of fictional story that has not got some kind of root in factual, learning that he can then sort of bring up in conversations or whatever. I think that's an interesting point. Something I've never thought about either.
But also, can non-fiction, because we're all talking about non-fiction as well, be a story? Yes, of course it can.
Yeah, 100%.
And can you learn from another person's experience and
100%.
story? Is that totally valid? Yes. We're having a raging debate about whether you can tell someone else's story in a valid way at the moment, which I find very interesting, and I don't fully have an answer.
Well, this is about representation, right? Men created fiction to distract women. So men are telling someone else's story.
To entertain.
Sorry, yellow wallpaper. But then we're also talking about non-fiction and the accessibility to that as a man. Is that because we've grown up with men's stories being telling in non-fiction in history consistently, overtly? As an LGBT plus person, I never saw my story told ever. I realised I was queer when I was at school. There was no LGBT education or historical education. I wasn't represented in fiction. That was under Section 28, which actively removed the ability to do that. So hearing what everyone says here, it's so funny because at the moment thinking about what I'm reading in fiction, the last three books are all by queer authors, unintentionally. I think it's because we're in this time in this movement where I'm like, oh my God, gimme, content. There's like Henry Fry, Lauren John Joseph, Leon Kahneman, and they're all wonderful storytellers who are telling stories where I go, oh God, I remember that happening. And that's the first time in my life, I'm 36, so that's really, really happened. But it's kind of what we're rooting around here.
Queer storytellers were writers who weren't telling their own
Yeah,
story,
exactly.
who've never told their own story.
Yeah.
Maybe Jane Austen was queer, we don't know.
Love that.
I hope so. I think she was.
Yeah.
I'm sure she was. She's so cool.
There's a
and she's
podcast
so,
in that somewhere.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That needs to be on the logbook. That needs to be on the logbook.
Afterwards.
We need that.
But she would be, now she would be out there writing loud and proud. And I totally understand what you're saying. There are no children's books for queer children. That is being changed now, totally. And a lot of, so our children's division are fully on that. In the same way there are so many more books for people of colour than there ever were. We have the colour in lit in colour, which is a massive thing to change the curriculum, which will also include queer stories. But it's also very shocking, and I think the only way I can identify that is seeing what's happened to women, which is why I brought that up. But women's stories are still belittled.
Totally,
still
100%,
belittled. So I published Marion Keyes, who's a hugely brilliant author, very funny, very clever, very witty, Irish author. And the Irish are great storytellers.
It's built into our history. It's called Shannosing.
It's built into your history. It's built into your beautiful language and your way of talking and your way of relaying a story. You can make Running for a Bus sound like the best story in the world. Well, she can. And she said at Hay Festival recently, she didn't talk about herself because she's too modest to do that. She said, what I do has been belittled and called commercial fiction for years because no one will... Because it suits men to do that. Sorry, not you, Tim.
No.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that because the literary world has been run by men, for a long time, who are like a boys' club. And therefore, commercial is it sells millions of books. We won't review it. And I found that when I really realised that, I found that so shocking and upsetting. Sue Townsend could never be shortlisted for the Booker back in the day. Never. Because she's a funny woman. Funny women are the worst of all. That's how I understand that feeling of being marginalised and not
totally,
which is terrible.
Well, there's an element of censorship in that too, because it's categorising someone. And then you think about booksellers and bookshops and libraries even, that libraries free accessibility to books. Well, who's deciding what books go in there? It's so intertwined and linked.
But it's moving on, and that's the good thing.
100%. And I think actually when you were saying just about the books you read, the last section of books I read was the Noughts and Crosses books. And I read them late. Like I remember my friends talking to them.
Incredible.
She's incredible. And reading that, and it's funny because it's fiction, but reading that, and I wish I read it when I wish I gave it to my 16-year-old self, but my 26-year-old self just enjoyed it just as much. And it was the first time I read a book and felt hatred towards a character and felt so much joy and passion towards characters, and it was like, wow. And actually, even though it's a fictional world, the lived experiences that I talked about in that book, I could relate to. I could just relate to the fact that there's so much love in that story, and at the end of the day, it's just two people that just, all they want to do is just be together. You can either take yourself back to that time, or you even know, even in your own mind, maybe you're looking at someone, you're dating someone, you're like, oh, will this work because of this? Even just that question alone was like, wow, to see this in a book portrayed back to me in such visceral terms, I was like, whoa, this, she was...
I think that's what's so exciting now, isn't it? That, you know, for so long, stories have been censored. The decision, you know, the powers that be that make decisions have given us one type of voice, whether that's in film or, you know, books or any type of medium. But now, I think, which is really exciting, is there's a real appetite for unknown voices or voices that haven't been at the fore previously. And I think that, you know, that comes across in films, in books, in journalism. And I think that what's something that's really important for anyone looking to tell new stories and find new stories is to look outside of themselves.
Yes.
I think we get... You know, we're all completely guilty of being stuck in our own echo chambers from time to time, which is natural because we all, you know, live in a certain bubble. We've all got main characters, exactly, related to book. But, you know, looking at different places in the world that maybe have different creative infrastructures, looking at places where stories haven't been coming from before, because I think, you know, there's been perhaps this very, very narrow-minded view that the only relevant stories have been sort of cis white stories. Yeah. But obviously that is not the case, and there have been stories coming from everywhere forever. We just haven't been looking for them. 100%. And I think what's so exciting now is that there is, like I was saying, an appetite to look for these new stories and to immerse yourself in them, even if you're not necessarily from that background. And I think that opens up a huge amount of sort of learning and debate. And, you know, to Louise's point, I still don't think there's a right answer. I don't have it, at least, about who should be allowed to tell other people's stories. But even the fact that we're getting into that debate, I think, is a good thing, because it means that these stories are coming to the forefront, which they haven't been for so long.
That's interesting, especially if you think about the movement through time and at-risk heritage. I interviewed someone 2 years ago for the podcast. His name was James. He was in his 80s, and he remembered seeing a poster on the wall of heaven talking about this strange virus that was coming to the UK. And that was his first memory of what we would call HIV, but then AIDS. And then he died earlier this year in January. And it was very emotional. But after I'd interviewed him and recorded him, he said he never remembered anyone asking those questions. And now that story is gone. So it's about sharing those other stories that aren't yours, but doing it now, you know, finding them now.
I think as long as it's authentic, that's the main thing. Of course, authentic to the person, the story, who it is, and authentic to the...
That's the word.
And authentic to the audience as well, because it's like, for example, being black, our black stories have been told, but sometimes not been told by the right people, and sometimes fed back to us, and we're like, we know that's not right, but okay, you're telling us, like, I think as long as it's authentic to the person, the story it is, and to the people that you're telling it to, I think you can... I'd like to think you can never go wrong. I want to know about your stories. So how did you guys get into the industry, and what was the challenges you faced as you got into the industry?
Someone else answers, because I've just got to dig back to remember. So long ago.
Okay, I can go first. So in the audio world, I started this CIC, Community Interest Company, about promoting women and non-binary people in music. And from that, I got into community radio, started doing a radio show, platforming those spaces, putting on nights across gig nights, and just giving a space for those people to, I suppose, share their stories, tell their stories, have that place. And through that, and whilst also volunteering at Switchboard, this charity, and then I'm on the board now, I'm one of the chairs of the charity. I was literally, I suppose, the way I got into podcasting and that kind of storytelling was rifling around in the attic one day at the charity, opening up a box, picking up this A4, this decrepit A4 book, opening it up, and as the pages fell onto my lap, the stories, these logbook entries, these calls from the 70s, 80s and 90s just fell out of the pages, and I was caught, I was taken. And I just knew I had to do something. So I spent 2 years in the archive reading these logbooks, cataloguing them, learning my stories, learning my history. And then I started doing presentations around the UK about telling these stories, these untold stories. And then from that, with another producer on the podcast, Adam, we interviewed hundreds of people from across the LGBTQ plus communities and created this podcast, which interweaves different themes covering those different years, from the HIV and AIDS crisis to challenges around having children, police raids of the 70s. And after that, the podcast did really well. It was great. I'm one of the hosts with Adam. And then we set up a podcast production company, which is called Aunt Nell, which means listen in Polari, which is this old queer language that grew up out of Cockney rhyming slang and Italian. And it's just that in itself is a wonderful method of
Say it again.
storytelling. Polari, P-O.
No, I know that. What's your podcast called?
The logbooks,
Yes.
and the production company is called Now, which is Listen. And now we're working on lots of other different podcasts and audio creation, and it's kind of telling those stories that haven't been told, that aren't necessarily mine. I can relate to the one I'm working on at the moment, Black and Gay Back in the Day, because it's queer history, but those aren't my stories, and those people we're bringing together through intergenerational conversations. It's like what you were saying, in your family and your girlfriend's family, your partner's family. You know, you didn't know that was going on because those conversations aren't always happening, and I suppose it's just about creating those spaces.
For me, if I sort of take it way back before sort of career type of trajectory, I've always been really interested in storytelling. I think because it comes from kind of my family background. Half my family is Irish and the other half is Jamaican, and both have a very, very rich storytelling kind of built into their history. My grandma has an incredible life story coming over from Jamaica to Northern Ireland in the 50s, and I kind of grew up hearing those stories, which always made me interested to, and I guess, be curious. And I think that that is something that I took through, you know, my school years. English was always my favourite subject. As a kid, I'd write like weird little books and things like that. And yeah, you know, we've all done it. And then I took a sort of a slight detour and thought I wanted to be a fashion designer, which was not the right choice. I did a foundation degree at Camberwell in fashion, and then actually came to LCC to study journalism, which again opened me up to, you know, even more stories and sort of the ways to actually tell them and get them out there. From there, whilst actually at LCC, I interned at, you know, anywhere that would take me, magazines, local newspapers, national newspapers, all over the place, just to sort of get more experience. I started working in women's magazines from the point of graduation, worked at a number of different places before landing at a documentary company where I made short form documentaries that were syndicated by places like The Guardian and The Huffington Post. From there, I started working at a fashion magazine where I started as the online editor and then worked up to become the editor. It was called Hunger, which is run by Rankin, who also actually started Dazed from here. So there's a trajectory there. And I was there for 6 years, which was amazing. I learned so much. I was kind of chucked in the deep end, which was actually great because it forced me to constantly think on my feet. You know, I've interviewed so many incredible people that I've learned a lot from over the years. And then from there, after 6 years of being the editor of the magazine, I took another slight detour and ended up at WeTransfer as the editor-in-chief of WePresent, which is, like I said earlier, the digital arts platform. And to tell you the truth, I was anxious about taking this role that I'm currently in because I'd never worked at a brand before. I was sort of like, oh, you know, is it selling out? You know, am I going to have to censor the type of stories I want to tell? Thankfully, that hasn't been the case at all, and the company gives us so much freedom to be able to tell stories that matter without any kind of brand, you know, interjection into them. And I've been there now for 3.5 years. And I think it's what I found interesting about the current role, and sort of talking to friends, you know, that I met here on the journalism course and are still very good friends with, is that a lot of people that studied traditional journalism are moving into brand storytelling, which I think is quite interesting because it again opens up you know, a new space for people to be able to tell stories. Some brand stories obviously are terrible, some are great, and I think some are really important. And I think that there's, you know, the more spaces that are receptive of stories, of representative stories, of diverse stories, and are getting them out into the sort of media and mainstream in any way, I think is a good thing. So I'm excited to see where the sort of future of that goes as well.
And Louise?
Well, I'm talking about how I got into it is just totally irrelevant. It's so long ago. So I think I won't bore people with that. But listening to you two, what I would say I did do is take a very long time, like a really long time, like 6, 7, 8 years to learn what I was doing before I took a big step into anything where I was actually responsible for, you know, any kind of money, really, or anything like that. And you've definitely both done the same. And I think that's the kind of message I would say is you don't have to rush anything. And of course, there's an imperative to earn money and need to keep yourself and live. And that goes side by side with really working out what you want to do. And that can take some time. And I'm seeing people coming into book publishing now in their 30s, late 20s, whereas I think when I started, it's like, okay, you hit the ground running at, you leave your college, if you go to college and you hit the ground running and you get a job and you stay in a job. That's just not the case anymore. And I don't think it's good to do that. I think you definitely need to feel around. And if you're going into a media industry, all these conversations are probably equally relevant to your students at the moment, because no one will really know what they want to do. I didn't know. I had no idea. So I would say I definitely learned what I was doing. And I learned what I was doing by literally learning about how a sentence works, how you do the punctuation, which is still incredibly important because it changes the meaning of everything. It doesn't feel important now because everyone's texting, WhatsApping. There's no punctuation, but actually it does change everything in a word, and the way we communicate and how we communicate responsibly is incredibly important. So actually learning that editing, that's what you do, and when to put things in and when not to put things in is really important. So I learned that. So I'm not a pure storyteller, but I can help someone tell a story. I can, you either have a gift of creativity, which is what we're talking about, or you have a gift of helping people be creative if you're in the media, which is what I do and what most people that come out of this college will do. There'll be the odd ranking, but actually most of us will just be having a really joyful life, hopefully helping others tell their stories. So that's what I always I found out quite quickly I wanted to do. I will say I was a great reader always, and I sort of, particularly fiction actually, I used to kind of buy a hardback of a favourite author with student grant at the expense of something else. It wasn't like, okay, I could just buy that because I really wanted it and read it. So I was always into stories, and I think you have to be in my job. It's no good just coming to publishing if you don't love reading, because you save it for someone else, But that was the thing I would say, is learn your craft and don't be too much of a rush, so that you can when you take the next step, you really know what you're talking about. You can sit in a room and you can really be authentic, and you can go yes or no, I do agree with that or I don't. Because actually going in and blagging it, bullshitting it, ain't gonna work. Yeah. Would you agree?
I love that. Don't rush your own story.
No, don't rush your own story. Yeah. That's what I would say.
What about your proudest achievement, guys, in industry?
I have one. I mentioned earlier in the conversation that one of the best stories I think I've been able to help facilitate, at least in my current job, is this short film called The Long Goodbye, which was created by Riz Ahmed and Anil Korea. It's about sort of rising intolerance in Britain. And earlier this year, we commissioned it in 2019. It was the first film that I'd commissioned in my new role. It was a bit of a risk because it was really brutal, and the company had never put out a story like this before. But everyone that read the treatment was like, "This is incredibly important. We need to make it." And cut a long story short, earlier this year we were lucky enough to win an Academy Award for it, for the best live action short film, which was incredible. But I think what was particularly a proud moment about it wasn't the shiny gold statue and like, oh yeah, look what we've got, but it was the fact that a really, really important story that resonated with so many people had reached that level of mainstream success, which meant that it opened up conversations with new audiences. It was a British film, but it made it over in sort of America as well, and where there's obviously a lot of synergy with intolerance, obviously, and what's happening in the different societies. And so I think for me it was great to win an award, and it was a lovely moment to hear it read out. But what was important was the fact that being able to facilitate this kind of story meant that so many other people were able to resonate with it, and I think that's something that I'll treasure.
Well done.
Thank you.
Really good.
I think finding other ways to tell similar stories, different platforms. So off of the back of the Logbooks podcast, we worked with two education charities and created an LGBT History Month assembly, which was audio clips of the people sharing their stories, and that could be played for any school that wanted to download it this February. So creating an assembly that went into, or potentially could have gone into, every single school, and imagining what it would have been like to be that little kid and listening to those different stories. We got it illustrated. It was like really accessible, really lovely. I feel really proud of that, because that's something that never would have happened when I was at school.
100%. Louise, yourself?
I can't think of a moment I'm particularly... there are lots of things, and I'm very proud.
Don't downplay yourself, Louise.
I think I'm really proud to work for Penguin. I love the Penguin brand. love that brand. And I mean, it's been helpful occasionally because other people love it. But I really am. I love it. Every time I go into the building where I work and I see that little orange disc with the bird in it, I go, because it has published the first of so many things. It has stood up for so many things. It does believe in inclusivity. It does believe in diversity. You know, it needs to stand for those things better and more. But actually, if you look back, it has stood up for things, and it will continue to do so. So it's meaningful to me in that way, and I think it should and it does say quality, whatever it does, which, you know, I bet your two productions do too. Your bet two jobs do too. And I do love that. And we try really, really hard. And we try really, really hard to be mindful of what we're doing and whether it's right or wrong. I'm sure we're gonna come a cropper at some point, and we'll have to deal with that. But we'll try and deal with it as honestly, and we'll lean into it as much as we can, because we have to keep that brand safe. And I think probably most people that work at Penguin, it's funny because if you work outside Penguin in the industry, it's like, oh, they love themselves, they're so they're just like, they're a bit arrogant. And that's just not the case. But when I got to Penguin, I thought, right. In fact, I was sacked almost the first day I got there, because I decided I wanted to change the colour of the disc because it didn't actually go with one of the jackets that I was really using. So we put, I think it was a lime green penguin on Marion Keyes' first book publishing, and the then CEO got me into his office and he went, if there's no room and there was like, we called them the brand police, because like, that has to be that size, it has to be that colour, the penguin has to be facing that way. And obviously now that's all rubbish, but then back in the day that was the thing. And he said, if you can't accommodate the penguin, then there's no place for you in this industry, in this company.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, I've been sacked. So I totally ignored it. Went back to my desk and just got on with my job, which is quite, when I look back on that now, I think, that's quite subversive really. But after a while, I got pulled into it and thinking, actually, I really couldn't work anywhere else if I work in publishing, because for me, it's the place, you know. And I think that's why people outside it don't like it very much. Just my personal. Yeah. So yeah, that's my proudest achievement, is working for Penguin.
So yeah, quickly, just to ask, but what is your advice to your university self? So put yourself back in those shoes. I guess for you, it'd be ignore everything your boss says and just continue going, right?
Okay, I will go there. I would say I didn't have any trajectory when I left university. I just didn't know what I wanted to do at all. I was one of the few people actually then that didn't, because most people did go straight into job. And I was quite worried about it. I was quite anxious. And I've got children who have left college and have similar feelings. It is a very anxious time. I would look back on myself and say, there's maybe no rhyme or reason to where you're going, but stay calm, because it will come.
Trust the process.
You know, it's so trust the process. Because if you've got friends who are medics and lawyers and doctors, and you just think, or actors, or you know, whatever it is, and I think, no, it's okay. Just stay calm and trust the process, and just do your best work wherever you are.
Nice.
Following on from that, I'd say trust your gut. You know, I think, and also be assertive. If I'm talking about my specific university self, I should have said no more. And I've worked in places that have, you know, treated me a certain way because I'm a woman, and also back then because I was a young woman. And it's things that if someone had said that to me now, there is no way I would take it. Yeah. But I've built confidence through, you know, age and experience. And I think that learning when to assert yourself as a young person going out into a new role is really important. I think there's a obviously don't be arrogant and go in thinking you know everything, because you don't. But also know what you're comfortable with, know what your morals are, know what your principles are, and if they are shaken, stand up for yourself. And you know, because I think you have to feel right about what you're doing. So I think trusting your gut and knowing what you will stand for and what you want to stand for is really important.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. Amazing.
Retweet, right?
I think for me, I completely agree with what Louise said. I think slowing down, don't rushing your story, don't rushing how long it takes to work out who you are and what your morals are. I think we're so overwhelmed when we're young, and it was very noisy in my head when I was that age, and I've learned to slow down and learn to listen to myself, and I think if you do that, then you're going to be fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, guys, and continue telling your own stories. Amazing stories, all of you. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. This is LCC Value Talks.